All right, this event is being recorded now. So welcome everyone. Like I mentioned, my name is Rebecca. I am the Administration and Programs Coordinator for the National Council of Jewish Women San Francisco. And I'm also a member of the International Alliance of Women. And the National Council of Jewish Women San Francisco is one of today's co-hosts. And our other co-host is also today's storyteller, and that is the Human Rights Special Interest Group. And I'd also like to recognize our co-sponsors of this event, the Orange County chapter of the United Nations Association USA, the San Francisco chapter of the United Nations Association USA, and the International Alliance of Women. So today's Zoom call, like I mentioned, is being recorded, and you are invited to put your questions into the chat at any point throughout our session. Our storytelling begins with 3 short stories called the CEDAW Trilogy. The stories follow historic women through their struggles to draft the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, create the 1979 Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and secure city and county-wide resolutions in support of CEDAW in the present day. After the close of the final curtain, we will hold a Q&A session. In furtherance of this year's CSW priority theme, the stories use digital technology to enhance the storytelling experience. The first and second stories are taped and edited, and the third story uses immersive Zoom technology that is widely available. Our storytelling is inspired by the UN's Good Human Rights Stories initiative. In 2018, Secretary General Guterres said he was, quote, convinced that the sharing of these human rights stories can have an exponentially positive effect. You may secure a written copy or video link to each copyrighted play by contacting the Human Rights Special Interest Group at humanrights.sig@gmail.com. The videos are also searchable in the YouTube channel for the Human Rights Special Interest Group. Just look for the channel under HRSIG and the photo of the peace dove. Today's session will also be posted to WOVA. Let's go now to the first play in the CEDAW trilogy, The Grand Dames of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR. It is 1948, and 3 women are meeting in the delegates' lounge at the temporary headquarters of the UN at Lake Success, New York. They are displeased with language in the draft UDHR, and they are pushing back against language that reads, quote, all men are created free and equal.
Saruchi. This is just what I needed. You know, this tea reminds me of the tea back home in India. It's my favorite, Royal Masala.
It's delicious. Thank you both for inviting me here. I love the informality of this lounge setting.
And I think it's a really good idea that we gather here together, step away from our official commission meetings, gather, share our concerns among colleagues, friendly colleagues. And hasn't it been an arduous couple months? I know at the end of the day, I am exhausted. But at least the men are exhausted too. And while we're talking about the men, I do have some concerns. I feel as though they do not respect me. They call me shrill, They portray me as a schoolmarm trying to corral unruly children. I don't think they respect or value the work of the commission. They call it a social committee, a committee that doesn't seem to be focused on the issues of the day, such as peace and economic stability following the war. Granted, those are very important issues, but not at the expense of human rights.
I don't sense that, Mrs. Roosevelt. They do respect you. I mean, you were elected unanimously as the chairman of the Human Rights Commission.
And thank you for nominating me, Mrs. Mehta. I'm convinced in my heart, I feel as though at the end of the day, our commission will draft a declaration that's going to stand the test of time.
It was my honor to nominate you, and I do believe our discussion today will enhance my work as the delegate from India. As you know, my country attaches the greatest importance to the work of this commission. In fact, we believe that it is going to impact the future of the United Nations.
Well, we have our work cut out for us. I've heard male delegates here, though, say that there's no discrimination against women and that women's rights are not infringed. They think we're just fretting over language in the proposed draft that the rights of men should be protected and that there's a brotherhood of men. How are we going to make changes of this discriminatory language?
Mrs. Begtrup, as chairman of the CSW, and by the way, you and I really need to talk about being referred to as chairmen of our commissions. Perhaps we can leave that for another day. But for now, do you believe that the concerns of the CSW are being heard by the Human Rights Commission?
Probably not. We're not invited to all of the meetings of your Human Rights Commission, Mrs. Roosevelt. We're invited to attend the meetings relating directly to women, such as the article on marriage, but we're not invited to attend many meetings. If women aren't going to be at the drafting table, how are we going to chip away at this?
You do raise a good point, Mrs. Begtrup. The perspectives of the CSW are very important, especially during the drafting of Article 1 of the resolution. I mean, the women need to be in the room where it happens. Quite a catchy phrase, don't you think? The room where it happens. Maybe one day a Broadway producer will put it in a musical and I'll be famous.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Do you know how Article 1 reads, actually, at present? All men, as members of one family, must be free and equal in dignity and rights.
You know, we don't agree with that. In fact, the delegation from India proposed the text that we should use the term all human persons. We don't believe in using the term man or men or brotherhood of men. Do you happen to have access to the minutes?
At least I'm able to see the minutes. But the CSW has applied to the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, for permission to attend all the meetings.
I grant you that the Human Rights Commission will follow any directive that comes from the ECOSOC.
That's good to know.
And I can also share with you that we've had recent discussions about Article 1 in my commission. And we heard from Mr. Koretsky, the delegate from the USSR, and he was very clear. He supports the language text change proposed by India.
Well, the delegate from France, Professor René Casson, refers often to the French Declaration of Independence, which reads, "All men are born free and equal under the law," and he claims that all men has always meant men and women.
You know what I think? We call this the Declaration of Human Rights. We don't call it the Declaration of Men's Rights. We believe in the dignity of the human person. And the delegate from Lebanon, Mr. Malik, he agrees with me.
Is it true, Mrs. Roosevelt? I was reading the minutes and they say that you agreed with the language that all men are free?
Let me remind you, I wear two hats. I wear my hat as the chairman of the Commission on Human Rights. In that role, I support the consensus of the commission members. When I wear my other hat, my hat as the delegate from the United States, I have proposed alternative text. And the text I have proposed would appear in the preamble. In the preamble, the text should read that the human rights are owed to every human person. I believe that if we put the human person language in the preamble, everyone reading our declaration in the years to come will understand that when Article 1 talks about men, everyone will understand that men is inclusive of women.
Truly, by clarifying the language in the preamble, we're going to clarify all of the language in this historic document? It just sounds a bit of double talk to me.
Mrs. Roosevelt, neither Mrs. Becktrup nor I have seen a copy of the preamble or what it looks like right now. Have you?
Nonetheless, the discussion has been completed in my commission on Article 1. A vote was taken. The vote was 12 in favor of using the word men, and there were 5 abstentions. There were no nays. No delegate voted against the language in Article 1, including the word men, not even the delegate from India, the delegate from the USSR, or from Lebanon.
Well, the CSW took the liberty to send our own proposed draft language directly to the Economic and Social Council, which reads, "All people are born free and equal under the law."
This is about the dignity of the human person, after all, not about man or men. Sadly, it's time for us to return to our commission meetings. Our meeting today has inspired me to challenge the long-held and unexamined notions and assumptions about women's status. I personally would rather not default to the male pronoun.
I do think it's been a valuable time together, and I appreciate that you've all come and shared your concerns with me.
Thank you, Mrs. Roosevelt. We still have a lot to discuss.
Play 1 left us with a cliffhanger of sorts. Just exactly what does the final version of Article 1 look like? The final version of Article 1 in the UDHR reads, quote, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood," end quote. The efforts of these grand dames fueled generations of wordsmiths. Today, we undertake modernization reviews of state laws and constitutions, much like the one underway in Virginia. We use software applications to uncover discriminatory language in administrative codes. Now, let's turn to the second play in the CEDAW trilogy, The Struggle for CEDAW. This play is a fictional documentary set in the mid-1970s. Women had recently paraded down Fifth Avenue in New York City in the Women's Strike for Equality. These women and countless others had faith that their rally mattered, especially at this time and in this place when almost all industry, unions, professions, military, and universities were led by men. Against this backdrop, women gathered at a session of the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, and were interviewed about their challenges in drafting CEDAW.
Women's struggle to be free from discrimination and violence has been seemingly endless. No uniform worldwide standard bound governments to protect and promote women's human rights. That is, until the 1970s, when a few unconventional women decided to write the first draft of CEDAW. CEDAW, the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, calls on governments to take all reasonable measures to ensure women's equality in moral, civic, and political life. 4 prominent women, all of them immersed in the work of the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, are determined to bring this convention to the UN General Assembly for a vote. They are Margaret Bruce from the United Kingdom and a UN Deputy Director, Leticia Ramos Shahani from the Philippines and the chairman of the CSW, and 2 delegates from the United States to the CSW, Patricia Hutar and Betty Athanasakos. Are your struggles with drafting documents about women's human rights something new for the Commission on Status of Women?
Well, no. It's still frustrating trying to get women's human rights taken seriously. Back when Eleanor Roosevelt was chairing the Commission on Human Rights back in the 40s, she struggled to get women written into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on an equal footing with men. And here we are, 25 years later, it's 1976, and we still do not see CEDAW as a priority.
So what other issues are taking top priority over CEDAW?
Delegates prefer to talk about nuclear disarmament and wait for some gross violation of women's human rights to surface before taking CEDAW seriously.
So how do you redirect the conversation back to CEDAW?
At the beginning, the CSW created a small informal working group, and this working group created a draft of CEDAW, and that draft was based on a consensus of the members of the informal group. Unfortunately, we bumped into a barrier. We were not able to find a member state willing to sponsor CEDAW.
Why was that? Why could you not find a member state willing to sponsor CEDAW?
There was a perception among member states that CEDAW would override domestic laws or obligate governments to enact laws about women's human rights. It's hard to believe that my own government, the United Kingdom, was not convinced there was a gap that needed to be filled with CEDAW. At least they didn't see it as a priority.
So what happened to the draft that was prepared by the informal working group?
It was set aside for a while. We really should have been applauding the work of the informal working group. But when no member state stepped up to sponsor the draft, we had to come up with a workaround. I took it upon myself with another delegate to write another draft of CEDAW.
And how was that draft received?
We certainly had a lot of pushback from government representatives, all male, I would add. We had to deal with their outdated attitudes about women and their roles. For example, they frequently cautioned us that the world was a very large and complicated place. We felt dismissed, as though they were saying that we were just silly women worrying about trivialities and not concerned with global issues like population control and economic development.
And are you not interested in population control?
Indeed, I am. Population control was a trigger point. Finally, the UN shifted its agenda from just security issues to women's issues.
Why do you think it took the UN so long to shift from security issues to women's issues and population control?
Until now, women didn't have a seat at the table where discussions about population control were underway. My colleagues and I thought it was unacceptable that women were excluded from the official delegation to the World Population Conference in Romania. The men at that conference failed to recognize high birth rates are linked to poverty, lack of education for girls, and lack of job opportunity for women. We are pleased the United States turned the corner and recognized population control as a women's rights issue.
And what happened to you after you submitted the draft to the CSW?
It's no secret that this go-alone strategy got me into a lot of hot water. Had I not been from an influential family in Manila, I'm sure I would have been replaced.
We made a good start, but our effort was slowed down by debates that arose during the first International Convention on Women at Mexico City in 1975.
Slowed down. What exactly do you mean by that?
There was a conflict over the agenda for the conference. Third world countries wanted to prioritize women's economic development. They argued that people who were hungry could not focus on issues such as equal pay or affirmative action, which were the issues the developed countries wanted to focus on. There was, however, a glimmer of hope. CEDAW was written in to the action plan that came out of the conference, and you will find reference to it in Article 197.
So did you follow the media coverage of the Mexico City conference?
Yes, it didn't help that the media reported that some countries were apathetic about the convention. The media also treated it as little more than a catfight. Rather than reporting on important women's rights issues, the media chose to report on the delegates jockeying for position, hobnobbing, and talking about politics.
Jockeying. That's an interesting word. What exactly went on at the conference?
Well, delegates spent a lot of time debating women's roles and promoting peace. This was no surprise, since the theme of the Mexico City conference was, after all, peace, development, and equality. And some thought communist countries intended to use the conference to undermine the United States. The concern was so great that Secretary of State Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, insisted First Lady Betty Ford not attend.
You were pretty successful, weren't you, marshaling all those delegates in Mexico? Was that helpful in getting your delegates back on the fast track?
Well, yes, I saw Article 197 of the Mexico City Conference World Plan of Action as my marching orders. And while it said we should give high priority to the preparation and adoption of CEDAW with effective procedures for its implementation, now we had a commitment from the delegates to write enforcement mechanisms into CEDAW, something with teeth that would hold countries accountable for upholding women's human rights.
Sounds like full speed ahead to me. But weren't you asked by the State Department to limit your advocacy?
Actually, yes. We were cautioned to work behind the scenes to avoid the predictable Soviet opposition to any American proposal.
What were you able to accomplish in the aftermath of the Mexico City conference? I mean, you were, after all, the president's chief appointee.
We've been very fortunate to have the support of the Ford administration, including President Ford and his wife, Betty. Also, the State Department has green-lighted almost every decision we've taken regarding CEDAW. For example, population control is a priority of our administration, and the State Department advised us to link population control to the issue of reproductive rights.
And how were you able to make this connection?
We were able to get language into the draft of CEDAW that calls on member states to ensure that women have access to health care services, including family planning. We also have included language that ensures women have the same rights as men regarding the number and spacing of their children. There is also language that ensures women have access to information and the means to access their rights.
So, do you now feel that CEDAW is approaching the finish line?
Yes, we are. But I'd like to add that our goal is not to change the world, but to end up with some solid, workable solutions that will raise public awareness and strengthen human rights for women.
And is there any work that remains to be done?
We still have work to do. We still need to hash out the makeup of the committee for CEDAW. Some people prefer to pull members of the committee from the CSW. I hope this discussion does not slow us down. But we're encouraged by the support we've received from the Ford administration, and I am very confident the U.S. will ratify CEDAW.
The UN General Assembly passed CEDAW on December 18, 1979. It went into effect in 1981 after the requisite number of countries ratified it. The following countries share the dubious distinction of opposing CEDAW. They are Somalia, Iran, Sudan, Palau, Tonga, and the United States of America.
'70s women were a force to be reckoned with, and the women who followed in their footsteps also inspired us. One of those inspirational women, U.S. Representative Shirley Chisholm, said, "You don't make progress by standing on the sidelines, whimpering and complaining. You make progress by implementing ideas." Now let's turn to the last play. The last play in the CEDAW trilogy is set in the present day. We take you via an immersive Zoom recording to the hearing room where a county board of supervisors is prepared to discuss a proposed resolution in support of CEDAW. Although the characters are fictional, the dialogue you're about to hear is inspired by recent statements and found in the public record and media communications. Chairman Irwin opens the hearing.
Today's session will come to order. We will begin with the proposed CEDAW resolution. After some opening remarks from our petitioner, I will ask each supervisor if they want to add a statement to the record. At this time, I yield the floor to Ms. Arnold. Ms. Arnold is the representative of the coalition of community organizations that have brought this proposal to us today. Ms. Arnold, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman Irwin. CEDAW is an acronym for the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. CEDAW is an international human rights treaty focused on gender equity and the empowerment of women and girls. It was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1979. This resolution is important for so many reasons. CEDAW promotes studies in gender equity. A gender study will gather and analyze information on the effects of discrimination of women, on their healthcare, safety, employment, housing, transportation, and homelessness. And that is just to name one advantage. Our coalition believes that respect for the human person begins at home, in our own community. We support all appropriate measures that seek to end discrimination against women. By adopting a CEDAW resolution today, our municipality would join other cities and counties across the nation, affirming fundamental human rights. A CEDAW resolution can have real impact, and San Francisco is a shining example. After adopting CEDAW, the city and county saw 44 months free from domestic violence-related homicides and an increase in women-owned small businesses. The San Francisco mayor established a task force on anti-human trafficking, and the gender analysis revealed the county's need to reflect gender diversity in its commissions and its boards. Other examples abound. In Los Angeles, a CEDAW ordinance led to a public library program to expose young women to math and science, and a 12-fold increase in public funding of contracts awarded annually to certified women-owned businesses. Our coalition believes that you will be applauded for your endorsement of this resolution and rewarded with our votes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Arnold. All of our supervisors have reviewed the resolution before us today. And now, Supervisor Auguste, would you like to add a statement to the record?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the CEDAW resolution. It is indisputable that women and girls are disproportionately impacted by the economic fallout from COVID-19. In September 2020 alone, 865,000 women left the US workforce. That's 4 times the number of men. And our Black women and Latinas experienced an even larger decrease in the labor force than white women. For a lot of these issues, the reason is a lack of childcare or paid family and medical leave. We still need to deal with the significant wage gap between men and women. Today's resolution will start the ball rolling by undertaking studies to expose these gender-based inequities. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Supervisor Auguste. Supervisor Strand, would you like to add a statement to the record?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Irwin. This resolution puts another layer of redundancy on an already overburdened government system. We have protections for women already on the books. This resolution changes the definition of women to include biological men. It's an effort to cement the idea that transgender individuals are women. If we follow this new definition to its logical conclusion, then anyone identifying as a woman will be able to mix with real women and girls in locker rooms, in their schools, in domestic violence centers, in homeless shelters. Biological men will compete with women unfairly in sports and take scholarships away from real women. I believe we need to draw the line somewhere. I cannot support this resolution until we resolve this issue. I vote no, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Supervisor Strand. Supervisor Peck, would you like to add a statement to the record?
Thank you, Chairman Irwin. Yes, I would like to add a statement. And to begin, let's not relitigate the fact that the recent downturn in the economy caused the loss of jobs to both men and women due to the pandemic. My statement today is going to be focused on the resolution at hand. I do not support the resolution. CEDAW is an international treaty that will tie the hands of America and force us to follow the will of a group of so-called experts who are sitting somewhere overseas in Europe debating women's human rights under the auspicious name of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. I wish they could do it. Now listen, I bear no ill will against women in any way. I'm a happily married man. I have 2 wonderful daughters and a granddaughter that I cherish. I wish nothing but the best for them. And I hope that we can do everything possible to make it happen for them. But I don't want this to be in the hands of the self-appointed experts who are sitting overseas and making things up. Look, you all know that the track record of the United Nations in enforcing its human rights treaties is not very good. I can just point out the single example of the Uyghur in China. The human rights treaties have not done them much good. I believe that we should not be ratifying or adopting any human rights treaties that the United Nations has shown it cannot enforce. And the result has been, despite the treaties, people have been experiencing discrimination, physical assaults, cultural persecution, and more, worse. I say no, enough.
Thank you, Supervisor Peck. Please let the record reflect that Supervisor Peck has left the meeting. Supervisor Sullivan, would you like to add a statement to the record?
Thank you, Chairman Irwin. I would. I want to address the inaccurate and misleading comments of my 2 colleagues. Just now, Supervisor Peck implied that CEDAW is controversial and has a lot of international opposition. And then he left the room. The truth is that CEDAW is overwhelmingly adopted internationally. Out of 193 countries in the United Nations, only 6 have failed to adopt CEDAW. The outlier countries include Iran, Sudan, Somalia, and the United States. The non-ratifying nations do not have a great track record on human rights. I, for one, do not find solace in America's association with those countries. What's equally chilling is that Supervisor Peck and Supervisor Strand totally disregard the intent of CEDAW. The intent is to promote fairness and respect for the dignity of all human persons. CEDAW raises awareness of inequities between men and women. We know discrimination against women exists, and CEDAW gives us a tool to collect data and scrutinize its causes. It is our duty as legislators to improve the lives of our constituents, and CEDAW gives us that opportunity. Furthermore, Supervisor Strand asks us to treat transgender women in a category all to themselves. This approach ignores the rampant gender discrimination and sexual violence against these individuals who are discriminated against as women. I suggest that my colleagues' laser focus on transgender women has deep-rooted biases that do not reflect human rights values, nor the will of her constituents. I vote in support of this resolution, and I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Sullivan. I too would like to add a statement to the record. Whenever any resolution comes before us that raises awareness of the inequities that women face, I believe it's leadership's duty to support it. Our county supports all of our citizens. Our policies support inclusion over exclusion and supports fairness over bias. If we had the laws on the books that were protecting women's human rights, we shouldn't still have the inequities that girls face in the classroom, the inequities between girls and boys in the classroom, or the inequities between women and men in the workplace. We shouldn't still have so many women with children living in poverty or unable to access public services. We shouldn't have girls and women suffering acutely from harassment and physical violence in the home, in the workplace, or in the community. With my vote, this resolution passes with a 3-2 majority. This county will support gender equity studies going forward, and we will scrutinize our existing policies and practices to verify our commitment to equality between women and men. On behalf of the board, I want to thank Ms. Arnold and the coalition for bringing this resolution before us today. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.
This is not just a deck of cards. This is a collection of 54 beautifully designed.
So we've closed the final curtain on the CEDAW trilogy, but struggles remain, and we still must call on women to promote and protect the core intent of CEDAW, that is to embrace the inherent dignity of women. We hope you will share your experiences and tell us how you continue in the struggle to raise awareness of women's human rights. So now we turn to our Q&A session to read your questions and to share perspectives. I am delighted to introduce our panelists, Antonia Levine, Ashley Ravichet, and Jill Follows. So just to get us started, the first question we have is for Jill Follows. And I would like to ask Jill, she is one of our storytellers from the Human Rights Special Interest Group. And Jill, what was your inspiration behind telling these stories?
Thank you, Rebecca. Human rights storytelling is can have an exponentially positive effect. These are the words of UN Secretary General Guterres and the inspiration that we had for writing the CEDAW trilogy. Today, when it appears as though gender equality is vanishing before our very eyes, we can use human rights storytelling to change people's hearts, uplift their spirits, and bring about social change.
Wonderful, thank you, Jill. So the CEDAW trilogy, it took us back to the 1940s when the world had just come out of World War II. And then it moved us into the 1970s when the US was engulfed in the women's rights movement. So the final play brought us back to the present day. And our next question is directed to Antonia Levine, who is the executive director of the National Council of Jewish Women San Francisco. Antonia, what has the history of CEDAW taught us that you think can be applied to today?
Thank you for having me today, and thank you for this question. It's amazing to see from the historic records that the country serving as an agent for the CEDAW to be drafted, passed as international law, not to be among the countries that ratified the convention. And especially looking at the third play to learn what may be the forces behind such strong opposition against CEDAW, and how misrepresentations, misinformation, scare, not based in facts, can completely overturn the initial enthusiasm and support for this convention. And what I would put forward as important, based on what we learn from the history, is that our work on raising awareness, informing women and men on both sides representing or associated with both political powers, the power of this awareness raising is critically important for the success of our movement toward ratification of the convention. And I'm representing here with Ashley and Rebecca a group of so many organizations unified, collaborating in the Ratify movement, which works to ensure the ratification of the convention, including by raising awareness about the current situation and why this is so important, and also explaining that misrepresentations about the content of the convention are in the basis of the opposition against its ratification.
Wonderful. Thank you, Antonia. So this is a question for Ashley. The final play was set in a hearing room where a board of supervisors reviewed a resolution in support of CEDAW. And Ashley, you're a member of the Human Rights Special Interest Group and current leader of the Ratify CEDAW movement in California that Antonia mentioned. So how can we prepare to counter any opposition to CEDAW resolutions?
So this is a really great question, and this is something that I'm still learning myself. But what I will share is just kind of that shift in attitudes that we are seeing, and this is nothing new. But a Pew study in 2015, which was shortly after the last time CEDAW was presented to our U.S. government for ratification, that Pew study started to track these cultural shifts in attitudes, the reversals in the gains that women's rights and the movement for women's equality had won. And it found that 67% of Americans agreed that people should be able to make statements that are offensive to minority groups, specifically in terms of gender. And yes, we do have freedom of speech and the First Amendment right, and that's probably where that percentage is based upon. But when we compare the US to the rest of the world, we rank #1 for tolerance of offensive or hate speech. This is the landscape that we are fighting within, that opposition. And that Pew study also found that 85% of Americans also want our government to act. They want more training and resources to counteract cyber hate, anti-defamation, opposition that we are seeing unfold in hearing rooms, especially in the fight for CEDAW. So what I would suggest is that we need to first recognize what the digital world is providing to us. Really look at those opportunities, but always also understand the obstacles. The digital world gives that flow of information, which is uncontrolled and it's unchecked, and it's in a format that we consume tirelessly. The algorithms that support profitability for platforms to share, to connect, they're not actually designed to protect the innocent from harm. So when conversations snowball into spaces of hate, we have no protections currently in this country to prevent that from happening. Whereas if it was on the streets and it was snowballing into actionable hate and violence, there are legal protections. So when we look at those impacts that we're having and what the effect of a global citizen's capacity to make an informed decision when you have so much information coming at you, it's a breeding ground for misinformation, for disinformation, for propaganda, for hate speech. And we are seeing social divisions, mistrust in institutions, and in my belief, it becomes a national security issue. So the conference is focused on that digital access and the digital tools. we utilized a Zoom platform to really emphasize that ease of access, but also to show how we are doing business in a public space today. And I would like to just quickly, to do level setting, explain really the difference between what disinformation, what misinformation is. I do have a slide, if you bear with me. If I can close it, to really explain the differences of what we are looking at and why it's so challenging. And then I want to give a couple recommendations for our advocates here to be able to move beyond some of those conversations. So hopefully you can see my screen. Disinformation is defined as information that is false and deliberately created to harm a person, a social group, or an organization. Misinformation, on the other hand, is information that is false, but it's not created with the intention of causing harm. And then we have malinformation. Malinformation is based on real facts, but it's manipulated specifically to inflict harm on a person, organization, or country. And lastly, we have hate speech. Hate speech is any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses discriminatory language about a person based on their religion, their ethnicity, their nationality, their race, their color, descent, gender, and other identifying factors. And this is really what we are seeing in the public space under those First Amendment protections. We're seeing a lot of hate speech, which is intended to be divisive, and it often can lead to offline harm and violence, which we will do a deeper dive in another one of our parallel events. So what we're seeing is a culture where people are believing that you're not just wrong in the opposition, but that what you believe is dangerous, and it's a danger to our country. And that notion I find to be the most dangerous. It's accelerated the growth over time. And what we saw at the hearing spaces over CEDAW was exactly that. We saw the time-tested arguments of stereotypical gender norms being attacked, where women would stand up and say, CEDAW doesn't protect me. Women need to look like me. They need to wear lipstick. They need to wear heels. This is what a woman looks like. CEDAW doesn't protect me. And we heard attacks on the broader inclusion of gender, where the misinformation campaign of what CEDAW stood for and what the actual convention is asking governments to do, which is a gender analysis to make informed decisions, turned into arguments over bathrooms, over school sports, over attacks on women who want equal access to services. And there was a lot of fear. So to answer your question, now that we've kind of put that background out, is how do we counter this opposition? Well, first, recognize that it exists. These are rooted in deep bias. So you need to research who your opposition is and what position they're coming from in order to figure out, as an advocate, how you can find common ground. Now, your opposition is not going to be looking for common ground with you, but I encourage us as advocates who are fighting for equality and fighting for even the opposition to participate, that we look for that common ground. And if that doesn't work, then I say you organize. You organize with your stakeholders, with your leaders, with your institutions that have the knowledge, that have the political power, and you tap that knowledge, such as plugging into our Ratify movement. This is a movement we're doing at a national level through the UNA of San Francisco, and many organizations, including some faces that I'm seeing today, are already participating in this national movement. So organize, join the Ratify movement, join forces. What we see in advocacy spaces is that movements are successful not from the personality of one or the fortitude of one organization. It really takes joining forces and often pairing with unlikely partnerships. So for example, disability rights. Disability activists fought for years to get access to curbs so that they in wheelchairs or with mobility issues could move through public streets. And for years, they were told it was too expensive or it was unnecessary. And when the disability activists paired with young mothers pushing their children with strollers, it appeared overnight. It became the law. So join forces. Don't think that your organization is the only perspective. There are many spaces and many ways to implement CEDAW, and I think we need to join forces with all. And then become an expert. We got to see some wonderful videos today and really dive down into the discussions that were happening as CEDAW, as Universal Declaration of Human Rights were being adopted. And you need to educate yourself to become that expert, because when you are speaking and you are advocating in these spaces, they are looking to you. Be prepared, have information on the talking points that you can help your stakeholders really get behind. And before I move on, I would say recognize what you can and what you cannot control. So I started the conversation with the shift in attitudes and trends. I think it's important for us to truly accept that we now live in a post-truth world where it doesn't matter really what the truth is. It's all that information that we have at our fingertips. And unless we are reviewing it from a pro and con, or reviewing it with the mindset that not everything you read is truthful, we will not truly understand how sophisticated these networks of misinformation are. And what we saw in San Diego, as an example, was that the opposition was highly mobilized, and they were highly mobilized on talking points that had absolutely nothing to do with CEDAW or the task at hand. And it took 15 hours of public hearings on a particular day, and it's turned into a life of its own. So I have more to share, but I'm going to pass it back to my fellow panelists. And remember self-care. These are hard spaces to advocate within. So lean on us, find your support system. And that's really ultimately at the end of the day, put the oxygen mask on yourself. How you handle the opposition comes from within. Treat them with dignity and respect, because their viewpoints are coming from a place of fear and misinformation, not over actual hate. But it can dissolve very quickly into something very dangerous. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ashley, for describing the opposition culture, outlining how to counter the opposition. I hope that was helpful to our audience. I'm going to pose a question again to Jill. We had a question from the audience that was, what new things did you learn when creating the plays? And I'll also add, what was the most enjoyable part for you when you were creating these?
Thanks. I think those two questions go hand in hand. So let me try it this way. For some of us, the story writing was the most enjoyable part, because those of us who like to dig into historical research were able to spot conflicts and angst. And that conflict that we discovered gave rise to the creation of the CEDAW trilogy. For others, the acting was cathartic. We were able to express our feelings, get out our exasperation and our annoyance at the belittlement and dismissiveness that was that our characters were exposed to. Still, others enjoyed the editing process. This is where we spotted bloopers. And when you go back and watch play number 1 in particular, you'll be able to spot a couple of things that shouldn't be there. And one of the things we did catch, though, in editing was the appearance of an Apple Watch on the wrist of Mrs. Begtrup. We know they weren't for sale in 1949. So that's the kind of editing fun. I mean, there was a lot of fun, and the members of the Human Rights Special Interest Group really pulled together to not only do the research, but do the writing, do the acting, and do the editing. And we did go out into our communities and grab more people interested in acting. We thank them all. But we inspired one another. We hope we have inspired you to write your own human rights stories. We believe that together, when we write collectively, all of these human rights stories will have what Guterres said, an exponentially positive effect.
Awesome. Thank you, Jill. And I know we have a couple audience members who are appreciative of the humor in the plays. So that was great. We have another audience question with regards to the California Bill 549. I think, Ashley, you could probably talk a little bit about that, and Antonia as well. You might have some insight into what individuals can do to support the bill.
That's right. So as part of the Ratify movement, we have been working on CEDAW resolutions and ordinances across the country. And we are now co-sponsoring AB 549, authored by Assemblywoman Lori Wilson, as the California Elimination of Discrimination Act against Women. And it is very exciting. This is the first state bill proposal to codify CEDAW and its framework. And really what we're seeking is pretty simple. We recognize the need to analyze the operations of all state departments, policies, and programs to identify discrimination in employment practices, budgets, and provisions of direct and indirect services. Most of our state departments and agencies already do this collection. However, they don't share the data, and that gender lens of that analysis is not occurring. So we need this bill because the economy is not gender neutral, and neither are the systems of our governments that we have created over time. So this very simple internal data collection, and then the support through the California Commission on the Status of Women and Girls, which is a state department as well. They are going to help as that expert. They are going to provide that support to the agencies to do that gender analysis. And so we're asking these agencies to do that internal collection, and then the assistance is there as a cost-saving measure with the California Commission on the Status of Women and Girls to really do that deep dive and then to create those recommendations, which is what the commission was created in the 60s to take up. So what we're finding is that this absence of the data is impeding progress. It's impeding progress for creating informed policy, for effective policies, and we're actually seeing the gender divide increasing rather than shrinking. In California, especially, the pay equity for Latinas has worsened. And this could be because of COVID. It could be for a lot of reasons. We cannot say for sure because we do not have access to the data. So what we're trying to do is look at this weak policy space in the legal and the financial environments. These are barriers to implementing CEDAW. The technical and financial challenges are also barriers to producing those gender statistics. And then that lack of access to the data and the limited capacity for commissions to utilize this gender statistic is another barrier. So AB 549 is the first attempt to bridge that gap between the agencies who are already doing this data collection, but providing them with the experts to make those informed decisions and recommendations so we can eliminate the discrimination that we're seeing unfold. How you can get involved is stay tuned. I have my email entered into the chat. We are going to be circulating a letter of support that all organizations can sign on. Otherwise, there's a link as well to the bill language itself. Feel free to review it and to submit your letter of support on your own. We're focusing on that data access as the primary talking point for the bill. And with that, I will leave it to some questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I don't know if Antonia, you'd like to add anything, and also maybe you could share a personal story about the struggle to promote CEDAW in general.
Well, I want to thank Ashley and just reconfirm that she's the expert and driving force behind our work on AB 549. And it's a great work, great organizing, great advocacy. I would add that we should repeat what California has done in the past, serving as a model for the whole country, for all the states and the federal law, with legislation that is progressive and passed in California first, and take the California Act on CEDAW to all the states and possibly to the federal government, so we can achieve the ratification of CEDAW, while working locally to make sure that CEDAW's laws become laws of our states or local municipalities. We should not forget that CEDAW, as an international law, provides mechanism to ensure the implementation by the government of all these regulations and requirements that the government agreed to. We cannot fully replace CEDAW by local legislation, unfortunately. So while we support Cities for CEDAW and now the new efforts to pass local legislation, we also chew gum as we walk, and we work on ratifying CEDAW. It's an embarrassment for all of us. So many years after passing a convention that we led as a country the efforts to pass, it's an embarrassment that we are still one of only 5 countries not ratifying this convention. And we have to just make sure that we pass this convention and have it ratified in the United States.
Thank you, Antonia. And I think that that creates a nice segue into another audience question.
Just a moment, I forgot to share one experience.
Certainly, yeah.
Which is redundant, it's repetitive, it's continued. Every time when I speak in front of audiences, including only and fully only women audiences in the United States, I notice that women don't know, or audience is unaware that we did not ratify the convention. People are shocked, which indicates that they have no knowledge of this fact. And if they decide to accept the information that I provide as true, and many times they don't even believe that this is possible, but if they accept that, their comment is, well, but we comply with all these requirements. We just don't want to ratify because of political reasons. And the reality is that we do not comply. We do not comply with many, many of the requirements of this convention. So again, my experience shows that the key, number one, part of our work must be raising awareness.
Great, thank you, Antonia. So there was an audience question that I think that probably all of you can take some part in answering, but the question is, what is the detriment to the US of not being a part of CEDAW, which Antonia kind of just mentioned a little bit about. But yeah, maybe we can hear a bit from everyone.
I'll start. I think the detriment of our country not participating in the ratification is that it signals to the rest of the world exactly what American values are. And it undermines any geopolitical negotiations that we would be having for current unrest on the security and protections of women in all spaces, in all sectors, everything from climate to clean air, clean water, food insecurity. We don't currently have those protections in our country. When we do the comparison of countries adopting CEDAW, for instance, Afghanistan, prior to the Taliban's recent takeover, Afghanistan had adopted CEDAW, and they had more gender parity in their elected officials in a period of a year achieved than the US government currently has today. They had more women and children going to school as a priority, more access to loans to boost their local economies, to run businesses than what the United States provides to its women and girls today. So when we really see the benefits unfold of adopting CEDAW, we can start to examine the detriments. The detriments are, we're not part of those conversations. The United States delegation, as you saw, helped shape the initial convention language. Our government supported it. It's been supported as a bipartisan issue. We've had 3 Democratic presidents and 2 Republican presidents submit CEDAW for ratification in Congress. And it's never achieved a vote on the floor because it's never been put on the agenda as a priority. So if we are not participating in these conversations of how the committee is evolving over time since it was adopted in the 1970s, it's really difficult to hear opposition complain about the takeaways. One of our videos did a great job of showing how industrialized countries have different priorities for implementing CEDAW than some of the more remote countries that are really just getting food to their people. And those conversations are not in conflict, but if we are not participating in them with our own gender analysis, then we are way behind even the most underdeveloped countries. So we're missing out. We're missing out on leading. And I'll leave it to my colleagues to respond.
We'd like to just encourage you to increase awareness among the members of your own organizations by perhaps just asking us for a copy of our plays. We'll give you the link. You can either ask for just the script, or we can give you the actual video link. And then you can play it out yourself with your own members live in living color. And we think that might generate the discussion that we are having in this group today. So in your own home, in your own community, where it matters, because you're in the room where it's happening, you can get the discussion going. So write to us at humanrights.sig gmail.com. Tell us if you'd like the copy of the script or the copy of any one of the 3 videos or all 3. We'll be delighted to get them to you. And we ask that you let us know in return how'd it go.
This is a great resource, Jill, and thank you for reminding people that they can receive it and how they can receive it. I want to add a little bit to Ashley's comments on the question that we have on the table. What are the implications of not ratifying CEDAW? They're detrimental to women's rights in America. Every one of us must understand that. Our country has not had evaluation of the current situation on women's rights for years. The only administration that voluntarily submitted to such evaluation by a team of the United Nations under the convention's mechanism for review was the Obama administration. The evaluation, the report from the evaluation was excruciating. It was shocking. The commission that performed the review shared that they are shocked from the status of women in America on all points that they usually review. So this is one strong incentive for all of us to push for ratification of this convention, because the monitoring mechanism of the convention will obligate our government to submit information about current situation and progress from the previous report and comply with the recommendation of the evaluating team of the United Nations. And this will also help the problem with not having data. When we ratify the convention, we'll agree to collect certain data that the convention requires on women's rights and submit it regularly, annually, from what I remember, to the CEDAW committee. And this will just push the government, once agreeing to do so, to submit and before that collect the data. And then the convention gives us a mechanism to make the government comply via submitting complaints about laws and policies that are in violation of women's rights or do not comply with the requirements of the convention. This is another instrument that we're lacking locally. So the reality is that by signing the convention, when the administration of Jimmy Carter did so, and it was approved by the Congress, we agreed to the spirit of this convention and to the goal of this convention. What we did not do is to ratify, which means to confirm that we changed our country's policies and laws to comply with this convention. And this is so shocking. It's shocking that we would not do so and deprive our women from a number of tools to ensure that their rights are protected in the United States.
Great, thank you everyone for your responses. We have a little bit of time left, so and I saw we have 2 more audience questions, so I'm going to try and kind of blend the 2 together because I think they are somewhat related. One audience member said that there is a powerful US senator who believes that the CEDAW four-year evaluation mandates what the US must do, when in reality, there are recommendations that are suggested and there's no actual mandate. So first question is, how do you counter this argument? And then the next question is, what are the biggest objections that you hear from local governments when you try and get local governments to adopt CEDAW, and how to counter those objections? Probably Ashley, you would be equipped to answer this question.
So I'll start with the US Senator who is clearly uninformed on the convention or the legal text of the convention. But CEDAW is not self-executing. And what that means is that ratifying CEDAW does not put the United States in a position to bend to the norms or the wills of international law. It's an acceptance of the treaty, that those are the goals that it will take over time. It's a framework. It's a framework for achieving equality for women, and it highlights conventions on specifically things that can be undertaken. The mandate is not a mandate to do anything other than to report that gender data. So the agreement of CEDAW and ratifying it as a US norm would be that they agree to transmit that gender analysis data in a recommendation that the US would draft and share its progress, share where it is in its equity, in its equality. So that's the only thing that it mandates. As far as how to counter that opposition, I would say educate yourself. Really, the United States and how we adopt a treaty, it goes through a lengthy process. And CEDAW as a treaty has gone through that process twice of the reservations, understandings, and declarations. And what that means is that the United States government has reviewed the treaty and has pulled out specific things that it reserves as questionable. And underneath those RUDs, that report that's created by the Congress, it's pulled out a couple different items over time. And it basically says that the US would not be bound to any international treaty if it adopted CEDAW. Unfortunately, the conclusion from that opposition is really that we don't need CEDAW. That's the connection that they are trying to say. They are trying to say that women's equality exists in the United States and we don't need it. A lot of the opposition at that level of government from the elected officials is that it's unnecessary. California tried to run a CEDAW bill under Governor Schwarzenegger. It passed unanimously, both houses, and then was vetoed by the governor at the time as being redundant, unnecessary, and this was 20 years ago. We can see from our own lived experiences that it's neither redundant or unnecessary. So the opposition that we're seeing currently at the local level is a lot of the same arguments that we had over the 40 years of CEDAW being in existence. What we're seeing now is really a conservative or faith-based organization opposition, where they are attacking the gender inclusivity of CEDAW because they personally do not believe in LGBTQI rights. The convention itself takes a very broad definition of women and gender, and this is what has been developed over time through the commission itself. And a lot of local advocates in opposition to CEDAW don't approve of that. And so what I would say as far as how to address that is that that is actually what government code is. Government code defines women and gender in the same terminology that we are using today, in that broad, inclusive way at the federal government level, at least in California. I'm unsure about every other state, but that is what government code is. So any opposition that says women are women and they only define it in terms of sex and not in terms of gender is missing really not only what current law is in this country, but they're missing the understanding of what inclusivity brings. And even if they are afraid of shared bathrooms or female sports being under attack, or anything else that I've heard in movements of pushing for adoption of CEDAW, they could actually have that gender analysis and then see for certain if their fears are founded and supported by data. Without that inclusive gender analysis, they will never know. They can continue to make broad claims about how it's harmful, but what we all know is that it's not harmful. It is inclusive, and it is intended to prevent future harm and to allow equal participation for all women and girls in this country.
Taking us back to perhaps just the, thank you, Ashley. Taking us back perhaps just to the beginning of that question, that first part about how do you counter some of the arguments that are opposed to CEDAW? If you take a look again at play number 3, where we had the Board of Supervisors, our fictional board, raising the pros and cons to a resolution, those words were taken from actual supervisors and community members who went and testified either in favor or in opposition to CEDAW. In San Diego, that's where we found the comments about transgender individuals. In Fairfax County, we find the supervisors talking about how some of them thought, one of them thought, that adopting the resolution would bind the United States to some international so-called expert group. We found also that same supervisor in our county here on the East Coast didn't like the track record that the UN had, and that's why you heard the reference to the Uyghurs. I can tell you that there is a document that the Human Rights Special Interest Group is pulling together called Counter Moves. And what we're doing is we're asking your contributions to help us create the list of opposition statements and the corollary list of what are your best responses, so that when you go in to propose a resolution, you are prepared. You know what you can say, what you should say to assure support for CEDAW. So if you'd like to take a look at our document as it exists now and contribute to it, we're talking about the opposition that comes in the form of misinformation or in the form of deflections or outdated norms. So hopefully we're covering all bases, and we do encourage you to help us develop this document called Counter Moves.
Thank you, Jill. This is great. We would love to contribute to the creation of this document. I want to go back to something very important that Ashley mentioned too, and it's the mechanism for reservations to a convention. The fact that every single convention and international law, when ratified, allows the country to reserve on some of the articles in this international law document, is the argument against any specific objection to specific regulations of CEDAW as international law. There is no problem at all for our lawmakers, our representatives, to ratify the convention with reservations on articles where no consensus can be reached.
Also, just doubling back to that original question, the second part of it, what are local governments doing? I can share with you that here in Fairfax County, where we have over 1 million people, our county supervisors did overwhelmingly pass a resolution in support of CEDAW on International Women's Day 1 year ago now, in 2022. And what has happened in the interim is that they are now funding a gender equity study. So we are moving forward, we're making progress, and it's just an example of the perseverance that I think we saw in the 3 shows, the 3 plays that show over time, historically, women who persevere get the job done.
Great way to conclude on a high note and
Yes.
optimistic note.
Yes, definitely. I did see there was a brief question in the chat, but I think most of it has been answered. The question was, have any U.S. women's groups made CEDAW a high priority, and what have they done about it, and how can we get more women's groups on board? And Ashley put in the chat the link to join the Ratify movement and register for monthly meetings and networking sessions. So I think that's a great way for more women's and men's groups, just groups in general, to get involved. So yeah.
Let's not forget to once again say thank you to our co-sponsors, all of whom are dominant in the field of pursuing human rights for all, and all includes women.
Yes, absolutely. We have the Orange County chapter of the United Nations Association USA. We have the San Francisco chapter of the UNA USA, the International Alliance of Women. And again, this session was co-hosted by the National Council of Jewish Women, San Francisco, and the Human Rights Special Interest Group. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope you join the Ratify movement.
Thank you all, and thank you to this distinguished panel.